Hi everyone! Today we're going to get into talking about plate tectonics, and we'll start with a brief review of last week and then get into what we know as continental drift. So today the goals are by the end of lecture and this week you'll be able to list Alfred Wegener's evidence for continental drift and explain then what was eventually used to prove the theory of plate tectonics, being seafloor stripes and the apparent polar wander. And you'll be able to use those seafloor stripes to actually calculate the age of the seafloor. So to start, let's just remember a little bit of what we learned previously. So here's a review of the structure of the Earth. So remember that the Earth differentiated into different layers as it was cooling. When the heaviest elements sunk to the center of the Earth, the least dense elements rose to the surface. So we have a couple different ways of looking at the cross-section of the Earth, being we can either look in terms of composition of the layers or the strength of the layers. So if we're looking by composition, we have the core at the center, we have the mantle, and then we have the crust on the outer edge. If we're looking at strength of the material, we have the inner core, the outer core, the mesosphere, the asthenosphere, and then the lithosphere on the surface. So also remember that our crust is the surface of the Earth. It's the outermost skin or the outermost shell, and it has a variable thickness. So the thickest part of the crust will be under mountain ranges. So you'll notice here, this is the thickest part in this diagram of the crust, whereas the thinnest part of our crust here, oceanic crust, is at mid-ocean ridges. So this is underwater, the blue is the ocean there. And that's because we have two different types of crust. So we have the continental crust, which underlies our continents, hence its name. It is less dense than our oceanic crust, and it has an average thickness of 35 to 40 kilometers, but it can range significantly. Oceanic crust, however, it is more basaltic. It underlies our oceans, so it is underwater for the most part. It is more dense than our continental crust, so the oceanic crust is denser, and the average thickness is about 7 to 10 kilometers, and it's pretty consistent. All oceanic crust. It doesn't vary much with distance. So our oceanic crust is much thinner and more dense than our continental crust is. So this is going to be important as we start learning about continental drift and the theory of plate tectonics. So continental drift really is an idea that has been around for quite a long time. In 1956, there was a map maker, he was Dutch, and he wrote that the Americas were torn away from Europe and Africa by earthquakes and floods. And he was the first person to write down, in terms of the first person that we have evidence of trying to explain that the continents had once fit together. In 1858, here are some pictures of maps by another geographer, also showing that here is at the time the current world map, and he also showed that it looked like the continents had at once fit together. In 1914, we had Alfred Wegener come up with continental drift. So let's talk about Alfred Wegener a little bit. He was born in 1880, and he is the first one that tried to prove continental drift, tried to prove that our continents were moving using scientific evidence. So he had four main pieces of evidence. This is a picture of him here. The continental jigsaw puzzle, matching fossils, matching rock types and structures along the edge of continents, as well as a mismatch of ancient climate zones. So I'm going to go through all four of those next in a little more detail. So Alfred Wegener first realized that shorelines make a really good fit. So he called this the continental puzzle, the jigsaw puzzle. So the present shorelines of our Earth today, of our continents, look like they could fit together. So you could cut out the continents and put them together into one larger continent. But what he noticed further is that if he looked at the entire piece of continental crust, some of which is underwater, so looking all the way at the extension of our continental shelf, not just our present day shoreline, but the actual continental shelf, so where our continent transitions from continental shelf to oceanic shelf, continental crust to oceanic crust, he found that the continents make an even better fit. So it's an almost perfect fit looking at the continental crust as a whole. He also found evidence of fossils across different, very separated land masses. So he found evidence of the same fossil on different continents. And these are fossils of non-flying, non-swimming organisms. So things that would not have been able to survive traveling across an entire ocean, for example. So that was another piece of evidence. He then looked at the geology along what you can think of as the zipper. So if you were to zip North America, Africa, Europe, Greenland, if you were to zip it up across throughout the Atlantic Ocean, you would notice that the geologic features match very well. So the structures, the rock type, and the rock ages, as well as the mountain belts. So there's a lot of evidence that these could have at once been the same geologic features that had then been split. The last thing he used as evidence is the climate and historical climate. So he found that the continents where they are today have evidence on them of historic climate that wouldn't make sense for their current locations. So for example, India has evidence of glacial deposits as well as far north in Africa, towards the center of Africa. Greenland, for example, has those, and Northern Europe has some evidence of much warmer climates. So he found that the continents where they are today don't necessarily match with the historical climatic record of the land there, signifying that these pieces of land might have been in a different position on Earth in the past. So the only way for India, for example, to have glacial deposits is if India was not in its current location. So continental drift was not a widely accepted theory. So he had this evidence, which is great. He had some pretty solid evidence, but he was ridiculed a bit. People did not believe him. So a lot of the pushback he got was that, well, maybe it's all just coincidence. Shorelines are always changing, they're always eroding. How could you expect to have a good fit across continents when our shorelines are always changing? Plant seeds could have traveled. Animals could have traveled other ways. So plants could have been, in terms of fossils, wind or current could have moved plant seeds, causing plants to grow on different continents. Animals maybe could have gotten across different continents by land bridges appearing or island hopping. Maybe your understanding of the geologic timescale is wrong. Maybe the timescale that you're using actually is wrong. And then the main pushback against his idea is, how do you move continents? How can you possibly move continents across the surface of the globe? There's so much friction. These are continents on Earth. They don't move. That was the understanding. There was no way that people could understand how these continents could possibly be moving across the surface of the Earth. And the problem for Alfred Wegener is he did not have an answer for that. So he saw all of this evidence that the continents must have, at one time, been in different positions, but he could not explain how that was physically possible. So how could the continents move? that is the big piece of evidence that he was missing. So he had no mechanism. He was actually asked to stop this investigation, stop writing about it, stop trying to publish about continental drift, and he was not very well accepted in the scientific world. However, about 30 years later, there were some technological advances that allowed for collection of more data and a lot more understanding of our Earth. And we came up, scientists as a whole, came up with the theory of plate tectonics, which is essentially an updated version of Alfred Wegener's continental drift. So in the 1950s and 60s, we had new technology that allowed us to study and investigate paleomagnetism, which is the magnetic field of the past using rocks, as well as studying features on the ocean floor, so actually mapping what the ocean floor looks like, and looking at patterns in earthquake locations. So the two big pieces of evidence that helped prove that Alfred Wegener was actually onto something correct is apparent polar wander, which showed the continents actually had moved, and also how they had moved. It was discovered seafloor spreading. So apparent polar wander and seafloor spreading are the two pieces of evidence that Alfred Wegener really needed, but unfortunately was not alive when this technology came out, actually proving that he was, in fact, correct. So in World War II, we started mapping the seafloor pretty extensively using sonar. So actually mapping what the bottom of the seafloor looks like. So a lot of oceanographers were very, very surprised to find that the deepest parts of the ocean actually occur near land. So the deepest parts of our ocean are actually right along our continents and not in the center of the ocean as they had believed. They also found mountain ranges running through every ocean basin. So underwater mountain ranges running all the way through the ocean basin. And they found submarine volcanoes. So underwater volcanoes in lines. So in a nicely formed lines across the ocean floor. These are things we had absolutely no idea what was going on the bottom of the ocean floor until World War II, when we started actually mapping what the ocean floor looks like. So here is a map of bathymetry and topography. So bathymetry is the ocean floor, so the depth of the ocean floor. Topography is the elevation of our surface. So we have the deepest parts of our ocean in dark blue, the shallow parts of our ocean in light blue. So you will notice here we do not have a very smooth ocean floor. There is quite a bit going on. So what we were able to determine when we started mapping the ocean floor is that there are these mountain ranges. So like this is a mountain range underwater across every ocean basin. So here's one. Here we have another mountain range. And then there's also lines of islands. So there are many, many, many islands. Here's a little line of islands that actually connects to this line of islands. Many of the islands are actually underwater. And then you'll notice that the deepest parts of our ocean, so the darkest blue on the map, is something like right here, right along our continent. So there's a very, 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 very deep trench along many of our continents, and those are actually the deepest parts of the ocean. So the deepest part of the ocean is not in the center, as they had believed originally. They're actually right along our continents. So by the end of this week, hopefully, you will all understand exactly what causes those three strange things about our ocean floor. So, seafloor spreading. So seafloor spreading creates mid-ocean ridges, deep sea trenches, and then can also be involved with creating seamount chains or underwater chains of volcanoes. So a mid-ocean ridge is that underwater mountain range. So the underwater mountain range in the center of the ocean basin we call a mid-ocean ridge. A trench, so the deep sea trench, is that very, 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 very deep, thin trench along our continents. So these are found on the edges of our oceans, right along our continents. So by about the 1950s, we had learned quite a bit about our ocean floor, I should say. We also learned that the ocean floor is covered in sediment, so it's not necessarily solid rock. There's quite a bit of sediment on the top layer of our ocean floor. What was found that was quite interesting is the layer of sediment actually gets thicker as you move away from the mid-ocean ridge. So as you move away from this mountain range in the center of the ocean, the amount of sediment actually increases. So the most sediment is furthest from the mid-ocean ridge. So ocean crust also has a basaltic composition. So that is a type of rock. It is a basalt. It's a more dense rock. So we're learning that this oceanic crust is more dense. They also found that these mid-ocean ridges that run through every ocean basin have very high heat flow. There's a lot of heat coming out of these mid-ocean ridges. So with this newer information, a man named Harry Hess came up with the concept of seafloor spreading. This was in the 1960s. So his idea is here we have a mid-ocean ridge. And his idea was that there's magma coming up from the center of the Earth, and it's rising up at mid-ocean ridges. What happens is that magma then cools and creates new ocean crust. So that new ocean crust is then pushed away from the mid-ocean ridge by the new magma. So there's constantly new magma coming up from the mantle up to the surface. Note, this is still all underwater at our mid-ocean ridge. So then as this new magma comes up, it pushes the newly formed crust away from the mid-ocean ridge. So he was right. This is sort of what happens. But what he couldn't understand or couldn't explain was if we're constantly creating new crust, we must also somewhere be destroying crust, or else the surface area of the Earth would just be increasing. So there must be somewhere that we are destroying crust, but he couldn't quite figure out how that was happening. So he assumed that somehow there was a type of subduction, which meant that the crust was then poking back into the mantle, being destroyed, but he couldn't figure out how or why that was happening. So the next piece of evidence we call paleomagnetism. So the Earth's magnetic field, or the direction of the Earth's magnetic field, is recorded by minerals in rocks that are magnetic. So when we start looking at minerals, you will learn that some of them are magnetic. So those magnetic minerals actually record the orientation of Earth's magnetic field. So when our molten rock, or our liquid rock, cools below a specific temperature, that record, those magnetic minerals, are permanently recorded in that rock. So permanently telling us the direction or the orientation of Earth's magnetic field. So when we cool to a below a certain temperature, it's between 350 and 580 C. So once we get below that point, the orientation of the magnetic minerals is going to be set in stone, literally set in the rock. So this is very helpful because it tells us the orientation of our magnetic poles in the direction of magnetic north in the past. So this is very, very, very cool. So the magnetism is actually preserved in our rocks over time, and then we can then measure them in a lab. So magnetic inclination is the angle between the magnetic field, here shown by the blue lines, and the surface of the Earth, or the Earth's surface. So here we have the magnetic field is about parallel to the surface of the Earth, whereas here we have it's totally perpendicular. The magnetic field is perpendicular to the surface of the Earth. There's also magnetic orientation. So this is that the magnetic minerals will actually point towards the pole, so just like a compass. The magnetic minerals will point towards the north magnetic pole. So another, the main piece of evidence that we gained from our new understanding of paleomagnetism we call apparent polar wander. So the magnetic poles on Earth, they wobble, they move over time, and they're not perfectly aligned with our north and south geographic poles on our map. It's pretty close. That's why compasses work, at least in the lower latitudes, but it's not exactly right. So magnetic declination is the angle between the geographic pole and the magnetic pole. So there is a difference between where we would have the Santa Claus's stick in the North Pole saying this is the North Pole versus the North Magnetic Pole. There is right now a slight difference. So what we're able to do is reconstruct where our magnetic pole was, where our magnetic North Pole was through time. So you can actually map how the magnetic pole has moved in the past based on the information that is trapped in the rock in terms of these magnetic minerals solidifying and setting in stone that paleomagnetism information. So what we're able to do is actually map backwards in time where our pole was. So the North Pole, the North Magnetic Pole, actually moved relative to this continent, relative to where we took this rock sample. Awesome. We know that the magnetic pole moves. We know that it wobbles. We know that it wiggles. But the interesting thing is that when this was done on multiple continents, we found that the wandering patterns were different. So if the pole was wandering, apparent polar wander, all of the continents would show the same pattern of the pole moving. However, we found very different patterns in the wandering patterns of our North Magnetic Pole. So what this means is that the pole wasn't necessarily wandering, it's the continents that are wandering. So the continents have moved over the surface of the Earth. So this was a big piece of evidence, unrefutable, that Alfred Wegener could have used when he was trying to prove his idea of continental drift. So we have now unrefutable evidence of this, what we originally thought of as apparent polar wander, but actually this is proving that our continents have moved because the paths of the recorded North Magnetic Pole locations don't match on different continents, meaning the continents must be in different orientation, must have been in different orientations in the past. So here is a video someone remade of the way that our Earth looked starting 500 million years ago through today. Here's 200 million years ago. And about 100 million years ago. So as you can see, our continents have been moving quite a bit in the past. There has been a lot going on. So another piece of evidence that we gained from understanding paleomagnetism is looking at seafloor stripes. So I'll explain those in a second. The polarity of Earth switches through time. So our north and south poles, so our north and south magnetic poles actually switch. So this is an area of research. We don't exactly know why this happens, but we do know that it does happen, and we do know when it has happened in the past because of what we call these seafloor stripes. So opposite polarity in rock layers that are next to each other, we consider reversal. So a magnetic reversal would be when we go from our normal situation, where north is where we consider north today, to our reversed situation, where our south magnetic pole is actually at our north geographic pole, and then vice versa. So today we are in a normal polarity situation where we have our north magnetic pole near our north geographic pole. So what we can do is actually look at rock that was created in the past, that cooled, that solidified that magnetic information, and look at the history of our polarity. So looking at when we were in a normal versus a reversed polarity, and how long each of those took. How many switches, how many reversals have we had? So here we have a volcano. So it is creating new layers of rock each time it erupts. And each time it erupts, that rock solidifies and captures that polarity information. So we can look back in time at the magnetic reversals using this these volcanic layers. So what we can also do is something similar, but on our seafloor. So at our mid-ocean ridge, which is our underwater mountain range, where we have seafloor spreading occurring, that seafloor spreading is magma rising up to the surface, up through the crust, and pushing the plates apart. So as that magma rises up, the plates will actually move to either side. But that magma is going to cool, creating new oceanic crust. That new oceanic crust, as it's cooling, is going to capture the polarity information of our Earth at the time that it is cooling. So that new crust is actually going to record the magnetic field information and give us a very detailed record of the patterns and also our magnetic reversals in the past. So I have a little video to show. This one. Here we go. So here we have our mid-ocean ridge. So this is the magma coming up to the surface. And when we have a dark stripe, that is signifying a time when we are in a normal polarity. When there are light stripes, that signifies a time when we're in a reversed polarity. So the rock isn't actually different colors, so there aren't physical visible stripes on the ground, but we always color them and we call them stripes when we are talking about this seafloor magnetic polarity. So either normal or reversed. There aren't real stripes, but we use the stripes so it's easier to see and understand. So you'll notice that over time, as our little arrow here moves through time from a normal polarity to reverse to normal, reverse to normal, you'll see that the pattern of the stripes changes. And we end in a normal polarity. So as that seafloor spreading continues, we continue to capture and record that polarity information. Whoop, there's the same video. Okay, so we can actually use these seafloor stripes to calculate the rate of spreading. So we can calculate how quickly these two continents are pushed apart by this seafloor spreading, by this mid-ocean ridge, by looking at the seafloor stripes. We can also calculate the age of a certain area of the seafloor if we know our spreading rate. So once you calculate the rate of spreading, you can actually calculate the age of a certain place on the seafloor. So how old is that rock? How long ago did that magma come up from the mantle and create that ocean crust? So the theory of plate tectonics expands Alfred Wegener's understanding by proving seafloor spreading is true, looking also at our polarity and our seafloor stripes, and using apparent polar wander, or tracking of our north magnetic pole through time, to show that the continents actually have moved relative to each other. So sadly, Alfred Wegener was right all along, and no one believed him for his whole entire life. So here we have a song, so you will always remember Alfred Wegener.
In the year of 1910, there was a scientist whose name was Alfred Wegener. He noticed that the continents looked just like pieces of a broken puzzle. By 1915, he called it continental drift. It caused a rift with his fellow scientists who sang, Alfred Wegener, you are a crazy man. Alfred Wegener, you are a crazy little man. They reminded him he had no proof for how or why the continents could do this. And until you show just how or why, you merely have one interesting hypothesis. Until this evidence we see, you don't have a theory. Alfred Wegener, you are a crazy man. Alfred Wegener, you are a crazy little man. In the year of 1930, on an expedition to Greenland, Wegener got caught in a blizzard. When they finally found him, it was much too late, and they buried him in an icy mausoleum. 30 years after he died, a new idea came to light. It changed the way geologists saw the world, continental drift back to life. Now everybody sings, yeehaw! Alfred Wegener, you are a brilliant man. Yeehaw! Alfred Wegener, you are a brilliant, brilliant man. Continental drift, Alfred Wegener's theory, continental drift. Alfred Wegener's theory, continental drift. Alfred Wegener's theory, continental drift. Alfred Wegener's brilliant theory.
I hope you all enjoyed that just as much as I did. It's my favorite part, possibly, of this entire class, is playing that song. I'm going to assume that you were all dancing just as I was as well. So, the theory of plate tectonics, first proposed by Alfred Wegener, and then completed once we understood a lot more of the physical processes of our crust, states that the Earth's lithosphere, which is the outer shell, is broken into multiple plates, multiple pieces, which we call plates, and they move relative to one another on top of the hot asthenosphere. So the asthenosphere is malleable, it's more plastic, it is a lot hotter. The lithospheric plates are very, very rigid. So they move actually on top of that plastic asthenosphere. So plate tectonics is awesome. Really, 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 really amazing. So the theory of plate tectonics explains our continental drift, where we have volcanoes, where we have earthquakes, and why they occur, how our continents form, how our oceans form, why on Earth do we have mountain ranges, trenches, and a lot of other geographic features. Different patterns of rock, so why do we have different patterns of rock in various locations, as well as our plants and animals across the world and our fossil record. So all of these things are explained by the theory of plate tectonics, the fact that our plates are moving with time. So to dive in a little more, we have to understand the lithosphere versus the asthenosphere. So the lithosphere is the uppermost layer. So the lithosphere has our upper mantle and our crust. So it's a very, very strong and rigid shell. So this is what is broken into our plates. So the lithosphere breaks up into our different tectonic plates. So the lithosphere, the topmost layer here. The asthenosphere is directly underneath. So this is the more malleable solid. So it moves, it flows very, very slowly, but it is still a solid. So it is like that melted plastic material. So it is quite warm and it flows very, very slowly. So our lithosphere is then, of course, broken into our two different types of crust. So the continental crust, again, is much thicker and lower density than our oceanic crust, which is very, very dense and quite thin. So these lithospheric plates essentially float on top of our asthenosphere. So here we have a map of our plate boundaries. So here the different plates are colored in different colors. There are some smaller ones that aren't shown on this map. We have both active and passive boundaries. So, margins. The active margin is where we have a plate boundary. So it's a boundary between two different plates. So there is some type of meeting there of our two different plates. So an active margin is where we have something going on. We have a plate boundary there. A passive margin, however, is where we have a transition from continental crust to oceanic crust, but there's no plate boundary. So this is the same plate, the South American plate. However, we have continental crust and oceanic crust. So this is a passive margin because there is a transition from one type of crust to the other, but there isn't actually a boundary. It's all on the same plate. So we also have a passive margin off the coast of the east coast of the U.S. Excuse me, here we go. So if we look at our plate boundaries, and then we look at the map of earthquakes on Earth, you'll notice there's a really serious pattern where we have our active margins and our plate boundaries. We see a lot of earthquake activity. Almost all of our earthquake activity actually happens right on those plate boundaries. Interesting. Excuse me. There are 3 different types of plate boundaries. So our 3 different types of plate boundaries we call divergent, where the plates are moving away from each other. We have convergent, where the plates are moving towards each other. And we have transform, where the plates are moving side by side. So they're sliding along each other. So we understand that plates move. We have our evidence. We know the different types of boundaries, but why is there motion in the first place? So the main reason is it's all to do mostly with heat. The main reason is convection. So there's convection going on in our inner layers of the Earth. So in the mantle, that more that solid, malleable material underneath our crust, we have convection of heat. So that magma, that materia is rising, it's cooling, it's sinking again, it's heating when it gets closer to the core, and then it rises up. So sort of like water boils, that's the idea of convection. So that circulation, that motion of heat, causes motion of our plates. And then, once our plates are moving, there's 2 different forces. One is called ridge push force. So this is where the difference in height of our ocean floor actually changes the gravitational push on our crust. So the differences in the gravitational push actually affect the way that our plates move, as well as what we call the slab pull force, which means as a plate is subducting into the mantle material, once it starts subducting, it's going to keep subducting because essentially it's going to fall towards the center of the Earth and it's going to pull the rest of the plate with it very slowly, but that is a factor in our plates moving. So when we think about the speed of plates moving, we think about 2 different terms. So we have relative plate velocity and absolute plate velocity. So relative plate velocity is the motion relative to another moving plate. So the motion of one plate relative to another. Whereas the absolute plate velocity is the velocity of the plates based on the mantle beneath. So relative to the mantle beneath, what is the absolute plate velocity? So there's 2 different ways that we can report on the speed of our plates moving. And then here is a map with arrows showing the red shows the absolute plate motion, and the black shows the relative plate motion, so relative to each other. So the longer the arrow, the faster the motion. So you'll notice here, this is our mid-ocean ridge. We have the plates moving away from each other, that it would be a divergent boundary moving away. Here we have what we call a convergent boundary because the arrows are moving towards each other. So that is all I have for this video. In the next video, we will go into those different types of plate boundaries in great detail.